Welcome to my third lecture on Greek art. Today we move away from public spaces to sculpture, along with temples, the art that for most of us defines ancient Greece. The first image that the College Board requires is the Anavisos Kouros from the Archaic period. But Greek sculpture begins much earlier. Sculptures such as the hero and centaur, which you've already seen, are much more stylized and triangular, yet they also show some of the characteristics that would set Greek sculpture apart, including nudity. The hero and centaur is an example of what is called the geometric period in Greek art. Moving forward a century, we come to a time when the Greeks were renewing trade with the Near East and more Eastern elements entered Greek art, but we also see the continued emergence of a distinctly Greek style. Note the interest in human anatomy, such as the hint of pectoral and abdominal muscles. The figure is also clearly designed to be viewed in the round. The placement of hands indicates that the Apollo sculpture was a votive offering, but unlike the Sumerian votive statues, the hands extend out into space. This is another important Greek innovation. Art historians use the term negative space to describe basically the area around a statue. Most Near Eastern sculpture makes relatively little use of negative space. The figures are very self-contained. Greek sculpted figures are beginning to reach into the space around them. Kore is female, Kouros is male, right? You need to keep those terms straight. Note that the Kore is wearing clothes. Men are usually depicted in the nude in Greek art, but women are clothed in Greek sculpture until a much later period, except sometimes goddesses, for some reason, occasionally get to run around in the buff. And now we move into the Greek art period that is covered in the AP Art History curriculum. We're now looking at art from the period when Athens is becoming a major commercial power in the Mediterranean and developing the system of direct, again, not representative, democracy that we talked about when we looked at the Agora. So, how does this early Kouros, which you saw in the Khan Academy video, represent a further development in Greek sculpture? I've juxtaposed it with the Orientalizing Apollo on the right. The torso of this Kouros is still triangular, but less unnaturally so. The legs have more musculature and a more realistic shape, and the neck is no longer stylized and elongated. The butt now looks like something this fellow could actually sit on. And finally, I get to one of our required works, and I hope you now see why I wanted to show you the earlier statues and the evolution of Greek sculpture over the previous 200 years. I think that just starting off with this work would give you a misleading impression of the evolution of Greek sculpture. This Kouros acted as a grave marker. We know from the inscription that the subject was a young man who died in battle. But how does this later Kouros show further development in Greek sculpture as compared with the New York Kouros on the left? While the statue retains the somewhat triangular shape, stylized hair, and the goofy expression that art historians call the archaic smile, this figure is more natural. The head is better proportioned, the planes of the head are not as flat, the hips are more rounded. Some of the original paint remains on this statue. Encaustic, another vocabulary word you need to know, is pigment mixed with hot wax and applied to the statue while it's still hot. It's actually quite tough to get paint to adhere to stone, and this was the most common technique. Remember Menkera and Queen? What similarities and differences do you observe? There are, in fact, many similarities. The figures are both frontal and bilaterally symmetrical. Although the left foot is moving forward, the rest of the body remains rigidly upright. Try it. It can't be done unless somehow you were unlucky enough to be born with a left leg that's longer than your right leg. The hair is stylized and the fists are clenched. But we see some important differences as well. The Greek sculpture is nude, but we also still see more defined musculature. Menkera is built, but he isn't boasting a six-pack like our Kouros. Note, too, that we don't see Menkera from the rear. He backs into stone. Our Kouros was created to be seen in the round. And finally, the Kouros makes somewhat more use of negative space. So, what gave the peplos Kore its name? Peplos was the name for a woolen belted garment, such as the one she's wearing. But as you heard on the Khan Academy video, there's actually some dispute over whether the outfit she's wearing is actually a peplos. There's also some dispute over the function of this statue. Many of the Korai, that's plural of Kore, found on the Acropolis were votive statues presenting offerings to a goddess. These Korai were much smaller than the life-size or larger-than-life Kouros grave markers, and that's something you don't really see on a slide. But there are good reasons to think that this statue was not an offering to a goddess, but instead a goddess herself. Her dress is deliberately simple. Other Korai on the Acropolis, like the statue on the right, wore much more fashionable attire. Some scholars think this simpler costume was one associated with the goddess Artemis. Holes in her head and in her right hand suggest that she originally wore a crown and carried something: a spear, if she was Athena, an arrow, if she was Artemis. Alas, these identifying attributes have gone missing long ago. The Peplos Korai also shows further advances away from archaic and toward classical sculpture. While her mouth retains that uplifted corners of an archaic smile, it's now much softer, more relaxed, and less triangular in form. The more developed form of the eyes corresponds to the equally developed forms of the body. She has a real shape under that heavy cloak. We know from traces of paint that the Korai and virtually all Greek statues were vividly painted. We're so accustomed to the lovely stark white of Greek marble statues that I think we would find the originals jarring and gaudy. What we're going to see now is the art of a culture that was supremely confident in itself in the face of a huge victory against a numerically stronger adversary, Persia, and the victory of a kind of democracy against empire. The Greeks would lose some of this confidence before long, as we'll see. But for now, when I first took a teacher institute for AP Art History, my instructor was very grumpy that Critias Boy had been excluded from the required works. The AP curriculum now goes straight from the Anavisos Kouros to Polykleitos' canon, which you see on the right. So why did my instructor call Critias Boy the missing link? The Critias Boy is the first statue known to use Contrapposto. You encountered this term when you watched the Khan Academy video about this work over the summer. Contrapposto is an Italian word that we would translate literally as counterpoise. One leg bears the weight while the other is relaxed. When this pose is captured realistically in art, it shows up as a tilt or asymmetry in an axis or imaginary line that we could draw across the hips and the shoulders. The Greeks described this dynamic counterbalance with the word symmetria. Bear with me. These slides I inherited from someone else, and they build with lines, and I frequently mess this up a little bit. So here is the Anavisos Kouros, with lines drawn to show the absence of Contrapposto. The body is unnaturally stiff, the shoulders are level, the hips are level, even the knees are level, but the left leg is thrust forward. If this pose were recreated in nature, that left leg would have to be 6 inches longer than the right leg. These axis lines, I'll start building them here, help illustrate the many ways in which Polykleitos used Contrapposto to create a more realistic pose. The left shoulder you'll see is higher than the right shoulder. There's an acute angle formed between the left shoulder and the right hip, which in turn is higher than the left hip. This is the counterpoise or balance, which is formed not by making the shoulder and hip straight or horizontal. The shoulders, you see, counterbalance the hips. Also notice how the knees, let's see if that'll work, very good, are not level but instead are angled. The turned and tilted head breaks out of the rigidly frontal pose of previous statues. This, too, adds to the naturalness of the pose. You should know by now that Polykleitos created this work as a kind of teaching tool to demonstrate the perfect proportions of the human body and how they can be captured in sculpture. Oops. Chiastic is really another term for symmetria, a balance between flexed and curved or straight lines. Again, a chiastic cross balance or symmetria is deliberately asymmetric, yet still it shows a kind of symmetry. The right arm and leg are straight, supporting the left side's flexed limbs. The head turns right while the hips twist left and the back foot turns outward. Overall, this produces a twist in the body, which in turn creates a sense of movement. And now we get to the scary part, the mathematics of perfect proportion. You may recall that the Egyptians used a proportional grid. The Greeks employed more sophisticated mathematics, deriving a ratio that they believe expressed perfect proportions. The golden ratio or golden section does show up in nature, by the way. Here are just a few illustrations. Rather than rely on my rusty mathematical training, I'd like to turn to a real expert to explain why the Greeks became so fascinated with mathematical ratios and what this particular ratio might mean. Let's hear from Donald Duck. Your homework included the grave stele of Hageso, but I'm going to talk about that in a later lecture, since I wanted to leave time for a little hands-on practice and fun with Greek sculpture. You'll probably figure out from this snipped photo that I borrowed this idea from another teacher, one who's more creative than I am. I hope Mrs. Whitaker will take photos of your masterpieces and send them from me too.